Happy holidays, everyone. I just want to say thank you to all my listeners for supporting Parcast this year. I wouldn't be able to do Haunted Places without you. Like many of you, I'm taking time off over the holiday. We won't release Haunted Places episodes on December 27th or January 3rd, but we'll be back with a brand new episode on January 10th. And while we're away, we ask that you do us a favor. Please tell one friend about your favorite Parcast podcast. This will help us out tremendously. Thanks again for listening. When you step inside the Château de Brissac, it feels like you're stepping into another time. You take in the foyer. The room is imposing. The walls are decorated with stuffed hunting trophies, and you feel the eyes of bucks and boars staring down at you. Your tour guide leads the group through the rooms of the chateau. In the golden drawing room, the walls are papered with gleaming silk, and the ceiling is an ornate puzzle of shapes, each one accented with more gold. Crystal chandeliers flank the huge stone mantel, intricately carved with a bust of the first Duke of Brissac. The other members of your tour group ooh and ah, taking pictures and staring at the ceiling with the same reverence they would show the Sistine Chapel. You're feeling unimpressed, but you're not here to admire the grandeur. You're only interested in meeting the Green Lady, who has inhabited the chateau for over 500 years. She's one of the most consistent spirits to reveal herself to travelers, and you've flown halfway around the world to document her existence. When the tour group heads downstairs to the wine cellar for a tasting, you carefully slip away, unnoticed. You move slowly to keep your footsteps quiet on the stone floors as you walk toward the chapel tower, where you know to look for La Dame Verte. The thick wooden door to the chapel is closed, but then you hear it. A woman moaning. La Dame Verte. Her pained sounds triggers your adrenaline, making your heart pound. She wails again, louder this time. You steady your nerves and put a hand on the doorknob. You take a deep breath and then turn the handle, ready to meet a ghost. Welcome to Haunted Places on the Parcast Network. I'm Greg Polson. Every Thursday, I take you to the scariest, eeriest, most haunted, real places on Earth. This week, join me on a supernatural journey to the Château de Brissac, an 11th century castle where Charlotte de Bréz and her lover were murdered by her jealous husband. And discover why, to this day, it's haunted. Listen to more episodes of Haunted Places, as well as Parcast's other podcasts on your favorite podcast directory. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast, on Twitter at Parcast Network, and at parcast.com. Many of you have asked how you can support Haunted Places. If you enjoyed the show, the best way to support us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. The Château de Brissac was not always the luxury mansion it is known as today. When it was built in the 11th century, the French counts of Anjou constructed it as a castle fort. It has been rebuilt over time. The only original structures remaining today are the twin castle towers. In one of those towers is the family chapel, home to the mysterious woman known as La Dame Verte. Charlotte de Bréz first lived in the chateau in the mid-1400s. The King of France, as a favor to the bride's mother, arranged marriage between Charlotte and Count Jacques de Bréz. Despite their 6 children, the union never quite took. When the 2-week respite from her husband was over, Charlotte sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair and deciding what jewelry to put on. Her imbecile of a husband had sent a messenger with a crude and direct note. He had returned. They would take communion together. It was a blunt, troubling end to what had been a magical 2 weeks. Her and Pierre alone in the chateau, free to play as though they were husband and wife. Their affair had started a few months before. Friends since childhood, the Count and Pierre had a brother's bond. But Charlotte and Pierre fell into a natural lust that took them both like wildfire. And when the Count announced an upcoming hunt, Charlotte had persuaded Pierre to stay behind. The Count had been so disappointed that Pierre wasn't joining, he nearly called the whole thing off. But Pierre, clever as always, had painted a picture for the Count of the trophy he would claim. Charlotte was already dreading the next gruesome addition to the Count's prized collection. But a fortnight alone with Pierre was worth another set of antlers on the wall. And now the Count was back, and the dream was over. Just thinking of it made her throw her brush on the vanity and frustration. He wasn't worth this much effort. With little urgency, Charlotte sauntered through the quiet hallways toward the chapel tower. Let him wait for me for once, she smirked to herself. Little victories were all she had left. When Mother first told her about the marriage arrangement, Charlotte had fantasized about her future Lancelot, a glorious, well-groomed nobleman in the countryside who respected her and took her on walks through the garden. The Count lived up to none of these expectations. He was a brute. He was rude, and he permanently smelled like horse manure. Mother had sold her off to secure her own place in society. And now, Charlotte was banished to the wild country with this repulsive lout. She knelt to pray in front of the altar in the chapel, counting her rosary, disappointed to see the Count had not yet arrived himself. Her thoughts naturally drifted to her Pierre, who was never late and never smelled of the barn. He was a true gentleman, an unwavering specimen of good upbringing. He could appreciate wine and music. Pierre was what Charlotte truly deserved, a salvation from the Count. Charlotte reminisced, then counted another Hail Mary in atonement. She was pulled from a reverie when she heard the Count's slow approach on the tower stairs. When he finally arrived, Charlotte stood to greet him. The flickering candles on the altar cast shadows on his face and made his eyes look dark and hooded. His movements were slower tonight. His limbs moved loosely. The way he forced his mouth into a smile made Charlotte curious. He looked pained with glee. Probably too much wine, she thought. But when he kissed Charlotte and held her close, she didn't smell any alcohol. He spoke in a clear, soft voice, telling her she looked beautiful tonight. Charlotte mumbled out a surprised thank you, and he released her. But his compliments continued. She was the most beautiful woman in the south of France, and everyone knew it. In fact, he had a gift for Charlotte to celebrate her beauty. She smiled uneasily, but something about this felt off. The Count was not a sentimental man. Gifts were quite unlike him. Charlotte tried to see what he was removing from his coat as he searched with his hand, puzzled. The Count produced a small jewelry box. Inside sat a necklace with a large pendant. Charlotte reached for the present, but the Count caught her hand. His large fingers squeezed around hers, grinding her knuckles into each other, making her wince. "Let me," he commanded. The Count released her and motioned for Charlotte to turn around. He removed the necklace from the box. "Turn around now." Charlotte obeyed, turning away from her husband, sweeping her hair to one side, exposing her neck. The Count moved closer to his wife, towering over her. She felt her heartbeat quicken, confused by his gesture. It all felt wrong. He gently placed the chain, letting the pendant settle on her chest. The Count leaned even closer, whispering in Charlotte's ear. "Pierre sends his love." He yanked the ends of the chain, pulling the necklace around her throat like a garrote, cutting into her skin. But the delicate necklace immediately snapped, freeing Charlotte. She screamed, calling for help, but the Count easily overpowered and tackled her. He drove his knee into her spine, pinning her down. But she continued her cries of fear. His huge hands closed around her neck, and her shouts were silenced. His knuckles scraped against her jaw as he squeezed, forcing her mouth closed. She tried to breathe through her nose, but couldn't. Tighter and tighter he squeezed. Charlotte's lungs burned, yearning for air. The Count grunted through clenched teeth as Charlotte fought against him. She searched desperately for breath and clawed at his hands. Her nails dug into his skin, drawing blood. But the Count squeezed tighter. Charlotte saw spots. Tighter. Pierre's blue eyes. Tighter. And then, darkness. For weeks after, the Count heard her screams. It started as nightmares, his mind replaying her death, her desperate final breaths, her shrill, panicked cries. He drank deeply from his wineglass. It didn't make the nightmares stop, but at least this way he could sleep. It was just past midnight, and the Count was on his third bottle. That awful woman. What a waste their marriage had been. Even now, in death, she plagued him, humiliated him. He should find a new wife as soon as possible. But this time, he would leave the king out of it. As his mind started to entertain the possibilities, his eyes grew heavier and heavier until he fell into a dreamless sleep. He woke up to loud cries of agony. His head pounded, and he wasn't sure if this was another nightmare, until the moans came again. It was a tormented sound that echoed through every room. The Count stood up, though he wobbled on his feet and lost his balance. He thudded hard onto his back, knocking the wind out of him. He tried to breathe and closed his eyes. He was acting like a fool, drunk, hearing things. The moan came again, louder, closer. The Count scrambled to his feet. First, he saw her hair. It peeked out from behind the door, dangling and swaying back and forth. Her head slowly came into view. It was tilted down, looking at the floor, so the Count was unable to see her face. She moaned again. It was deep and full, and seemed to penetrate every inch of the room. The moan became part of him, pounding in his head. He crossed himself. "Oh, Charlotte, what have I done?" Her skin had gone gray, decayed, exposing sinew and tendons, and the beginnings of bone. The moan grew louder and louder. It was in everything, the walls, the bed, his ears. The room even shivered with a vibration of sound. The Count fell to his knees. The cacophony was so loud he could not even hear himself scream. From that moment on, the Count would not have another second's peace. The ghost of his dearly departed showed him more attention now than she ever had in life. He had her complete, undivided attention. The moans were always there now, sometimes loud, sometimes soft. She stalked him through the chateau with her constant wails. When she wasn't screaming, she taunted him, told him all the ways he was going to die in this house. She would make sure of it. Months after Charlotte's death, imperial soldiers stormed the chateau. They had orders from the King of France to arrest the Count for killing Charlotte. They found him in the Tower Chapel, slumped over in one of the pews, reduced to a shell. His eyes were so bloodshot he could barely see. His face looked sunken. They told him the king's punishment. He would spend the rest of his life in a dungeon. The Count wept with relief. He stood from the pew and surrendered himself to the closest guard. As they shackled him, he laughed, delighted, practically dancing. As they escorted him out of the chateau, he continued to cackle with glee. He didn't care where he was going, as long as Charlotte couldn't follow. Charlotte de Brissac was murdered by her husband Jacques on the night of May 31st, 1477, after he found out about her affair. King Charles VII was furious. After all, Charlotte was his beloved but illegitimate stepdaughter. He threw Jacques into prison and passed the chateau onto the couple's son. One would think that with justice served, the saga would be over. But it seems that Charlotte must have had some unfinished business, as her spirit remains in the castle to this day. Coming up, we'll hear more about Charlotte's continued presence in the Château de Brissac.
As the giant grew closer, Enceladus realized something was wrong. Instead of legs, Enceladus and his brother giants slithered on two large serpents with snapping maws where the feet should be. But this giant's serpents weren't snapping, and its face sagged. An arrow whizzed past Enceladus' face. This wasn't a giant. It was a god.
You foolish, foolish giant. No one rebels against the gods and escapes unscathed.
Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, peeled off the face of a giant she'd flayed alive, revealing her own face, dripping with blood.
Parcast's New Mythology podcast dramatizes ancient myths for a modern audience and dives into their history, origins, and meaning. Hosted by my friend Vanessa Richardson, Mythology uses an ensemble cast to bring these stories to life. Every episode dramatizes an exciting story pulled from the beliefs of ancient cultures and gives insight into how our ancestors saw the universe. Stick around after this episode to hear a preview of Mythology's Part 1 on the Greek goddess Athena. New episodes come out every Tuesday. Search for and subscribe to Mythology wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, back to the story. The residents of the chateau claim that more than a memory still walks the halls of Brissac. Charlotte's ghost is referred to colloquially as La Dame Verte, or the Green Lady, and her dying moans of agony have been heard on every floor. Her spirit has been seen primarily haunting the chapel tower, though she typically only reveals herself to men. In the early 1600s, the Château de Brissac was rebuilt by Charles II of Causse. For his support in the French Wars of Religion, Charles had been awarded the property, the title Duke of Brissac, and the funds to renovate by King Henry IV. He converted the dilapidated medieval castle into a 7-story masterpiece that is still today the tallest chateau in all of France. But a renovation won't do much to remove a vengeful spirit. Chloe watched from the stone foyer of the chateau as the household staff unloaded trunk after trunk of her and her husband Charles's possessions. She was trying her best to contain her excitement about moving into the chateau in front of poor Charles. His father's death was an unexpected blow. She'd never been able to get the details directly from her husband, but she knew enough from the gossiping staff. Charles Sr. had gone down to the wine cellar to retrieve a special bottle for his dinner party guests. Only he was allowed in the wine cellar. A key hung around his neck at all times. The gathered guests were giving him a proper send-off before his weeks of travel, and had gone through several bottles already. When Charles Sr. didn't return to the table with reinforcements, the party assumed he had retired to rest up for his trip. They continued to drink without him, late into the night. It wasn't until Charles Sr. missed his scheduled return date, nearly a month later, that anyone thought he might be missing. And it wasn't until a foul smell began to emanate from the wine cellar that anyone realized he had never left. The physician said he must have locked himself in the cellar accidentally. No one heard his cries for help through the thick stone. And even if they had, Charles Sr. held the only key. Now, Chloe's husband, Charles III, was the reigning Duke of Brissac. After the funeral, they had gone home to pack up their Paris apartment and relocate to the chateau, where Chloe would be a duchess. While Chloe felt at home, Charles said the house was full of ghosts. First his mother, who died giving birth to him. Then his father, dead of either drink or stupid pride. The chateau brought back all these painful memories. But Charles was a man of duty. It was his responsibility to assume the title of Duke, and the Duke of Brissac lived in the Château de Brissac. End of story. They had only been married a year, and she was still falling deeper in love with him. Every day she noticed a new detail: how he corrected the horse master's saddling without insulting him. How he only drank wine with dinner, if he didn't plan on reading that night. In the chateau, she felt a closeness to Charles that she had never thought possible. In the intimacy of these walls, he truly became the love of her life. But there was a change in Charles now. At night, when they lay in bed together, Charles would fall silent. He'd lie perfectly still, barely breathing, listening for something. If she tried to ask him why, or any questions at all, Charles quickly hushed her, commanding her only to listen. The house was whispering. A voice followed him in the dark. When he closed his eyes, it only got louder. When Chloe held him, it was deafening. As he spoke, his face went pale and his mouth tightened. She'd never seen him so afraid, but she couldn't hear anything. Chloe watched Charles from the opposite end of the dining room table, picking at his food instead of eating it. Silence hung heavy in the room. His clothes were starting to hang on his slight frame, his cheekbones sharp in his profile. After several terse moments, Charles stood from the table and left the dining room, his plate full of food. It continued like this. Charles refused to eat, hardly slept, and seemed to do his duties with an aimless responsibility. Then, one day, he finally fell asleep. She watched his chest slowly rising and falling, and tried to measure her own breaths to match the movement. Charles hadn't slept through the night in months, and Chloe knew if she moved an inch, it would break the spell. Instead, she stayed frozen next to him, listening to him in this rare moment of peace. But it had been so long since she had touched him. Surely a graze wouldn't hurt, if only to feel him for the briefest moment. She carefully turned her head to face him. His breath stayed even, his eyes still closed. Her heart ached for him. Slowly, she lifted her arm. Gently, she reached over to brush the hair back from his forehead. His face remained peaceful. He almost smiled in his sleep. She dared to move closer. Chloe softly kissed Charles's forehead. But the moment her lips touched his skin, he snapped awake. His eyes stretched open, almost trembling as they looked at Chloe. He cried out and pushed Chloe away from him. No, you can't! You mustn't touch me! She tried to calm him down, cupping his face in her hands, but his body contorted in agony. He scrambled out of the bed and looked wildly around the room. Chloe took a step toward him, but Charles retreated to the far corner and cowered. No! Please, no! He covered his ears with his hands. Chloe tried again to hold him, to soothe him, but Charles was frantic. Get out! He started to tremble. Chloe begged him, just tell her what to do. But Charles was lost in his pain. Get out! It was a desperate, raspy whisper. Get out! Get out! Get out! His begging voice followed her as her trembling legs took her out of the room and down the cold, lonely hallway. The next morning, Chloe heard the kitchen staff discussing Charles's latest episode while they prepared breakfast. Everyone in the chateau heard him screaming in the night, screaming about the whispers, the voice, La Dame there. That name was what the staff whispered to each other when they thought Chloe couldn't hear. Charles had told her the story of La Dame Vert once, but that's all it was. Just a story told to him as a boy by a nanny trying to entertain him and keep him quiet. But now, it was so much more than a story. Every day, he was more and more consumed by La Dame Vert. And her whispers became threats, taunting him, telling him that Chloe would hurt him. Anything she said to tell him otherwise was drowned out by La Dame Vert. One afternoon, she found half the household staff huddled outside the library in the East Wing. Charles had barricaded himself inside after finding several bruises he couldn't explain. He raved on the other side of the door, bellowing accusations. Someone was trying to kill him. Everyone around him wanted to hurt him. La Dame Vert would use all of them against him if he let them. He hurled a chair against the door with a thunk and a crack. Another chair soon followed. Charles cackled as he built his barricade, sending more pieces of wood into walloping splinters. Chloe sent one of the men to get a physician and ordered the rest of the staff away from the hallway. Charles hissed through the door. Idiot! I need a priest, not a doctor! Another chair slammed into the pile. When the physician arrived, Chloe had them cut down the library door with axes. Charles wailed to be left alone as they chopped through the thick oak. It took another hour to move aside the pile of smashed tables and chairs and bookcases. Inside, they saw the destruction. Charles had taken every book from the shelves and ripped out pages from the different volumes. The curtains were yanked down into a crumpled heap on the floor. He was shredding all the silk wallpaper he could reach, yelling that he would find La Dame Verre's hiding place in the walls. Charles kicked and bit and thrashed against them, like a wounded feral animal, begging to be left alone. Chloe tried to go to him, but the doctor held her back. He hurled debris and swung at them with one of the broken chair legs. One of the men retreated from the fray, holding his cheek, trying to stop the bleeding where Charles had left a deep gash. It took 5 men to eventually drag him out of the room. She knew she would have to tell him about the baby soon. But he was so fragile, and she felt paralyzed. Each kick and movement the baby made reminded her that she was running out of time. Once her maids noticed her belly, the news rippled through the rest of the staff. She never found out who it was who broke the news to Charles, but it was clear to everyone the day he found out. For a few hours, the light in Charles returned. He went to his father's wine cellar and brought up as many bottles of champagne as he could carry. He sent for musicians and insisted on a feast. If La Dame Verre was speaking, Charles wasn't listening. He held Chloe tightly, without any pain. All of the fear that had plagued Chloe lifted. It was fresh air after the weeks of suffering, but it was destined to be short-lived. When Chloe woke up the next morning, the sun just pinking up the sky, she could feel another person's presence in the room, and her heartbeat quickened. She rolled over in bed to face the room and yelped. Charles stood motionless at her bedside, staring down at her in the dark. He was deep under the influence of his torment. When he looked at her, it was as though he was looking at nothing at all. "Charles?" she questioned. He remained motionless, his lips pursed tightly. Her heart pounded. In a flash, Charles lashed out at her, trying to grab her. She slipped under his reach and scrambled out of the bed, running down the hallway, holding her large belly, shouting for help. Charles gave chase. She could hear his frantic footsteps behind her. Chloe's feet took her to the chapel tower. When she got there, she finally discovered where Charles had spent his nights. There were scattered papers and food detritus everywhere. The candles were all spent, and the morning light couldn't yet penetrate the tower windows. Shadows on the carved mantel brought out concern in the faces of the apostles in the display. Charles had attacked the holy men with a knife, gouging out their carved eyes. Red candle wax dripped down their bodies. Charles appeared in the doorway. He held a long, glimmering knife. She screamed and ducked into one of the pews, trying to hide her growing belly behind the wood, praying to every maternal saint she could think of for help. Charles stalked her, letting the heavy knife swing loosely in his hand. "You can't have my birthright," he accused Chloe of trying to force him out of the chateau. Once she had his son, she would use the baby to claim his title. She wanted the chateau for her own, just like La Dame Verre told him. She could see the rage boiling under his skin. Chloe tried to talk him down. She would never want to be here without him. His footsteps were slow, but he stared directly into Chloe's eyes as he stalked closer toward her. She started to cry and begged Charles to stop. She would leave if that would help him. He scoffed at that. "You admit it. You'd steal my baby. My name." Charles stood over her, holding the knife firmly now, with intention. Chloe closed her eyes, bracing for the pain. She'd named the baby Charles IV out of obligation. He fussed and squalled as Chloe walked him through the halls of the chateau. He could always tell where they were headed whenever she started down the steps to the cellar, and immediately resisted, squirming in her arms. When Chloe reached the bottom floor, she took the 40 steps to the door of the wine cellar. The baby wriggled in her grasp. Charles sat there on the floor, motionless. She held up the baby so he could see his father. She wasn't sure how long she would maintain the daily ritual, but for now, it gave her hope. The last light in Charles had been brought out by his son. If one smile or word from him would bring back her love, she had to try. But today was the same as every day before. Charles never moved, slumped against the far wall, his hair wild and covering most of his face. He never stopped mumbling to himself the constant nonsense about La Dame Verte. Chloe waited until the baby grew too restless, then closed the window. She held her son close and comforted him, cooing to him. They would try again tomorrow. The Brissac family has inhabited the chateau almost continuously since inheriting the property in the 1600s. Charles was one of many generations that has reported run-ins with La Dame Verte through the years. She almost exclusively reveals herself to men. Most have seen her in the chapel tower, the site of where she was murdered. She waits there, looking for ways to make lovers suffer as a form of twisted revenge. Coming up, we'll have more on the terrors of La Dame Verte. Now back to the story. Though all agree she still haunts the castle, there are differing accounts on how Charlotte de Brissac was murdered at the Château de Brissac. Some say the Count lured her to the chapel under pretense, already knowing about the infidelity and wanting to compel a confession from Charlotte. Whether it was the avowal of the affair or her reluctance to corroborate what he thought he knew, one story says the Count strangled Charlotte on the steps of the altar. Other recollections insist that the Count actually caught Charlotte and her lover in the throes of passion. Incensed, he drew his sword and killed them both, stabbing them 100 times, right there in bed. Visitors to the chateau who have encountered Charlotte's ghost describe her wearing a green dress with gashes on her face and body that resemble stab wounds. This could lend credence to the account that this was a crime of passion. However, Charlotte's ghost is known to almost exclusively haunt the chapel tower of the Château de Brissac, possibly indicating the chapel as the true site of her death, where every night she dies again. Andrew couldn't sleep. Apparently, the authentic chateau experience went all the way to include the mattress. It was an antique four-poster frame with a gold-embroidered draped canopy, and was in fact the lumpiest surface his back had ever experienced. Andrew tried adjusting his pillows again, but it was useless. You'd think that a house built for French nobility could afford to spring for a Tempur-Pedic, especially when he was paying $500 a night. Miranda snored heavily next to him, like she did when she took a sleeping pill. She had blamed it on the jet lag. It was still the middle of the afternoon in New York, she said, but he knew it was to avoid him. Even in this place, in the middle of a foreign country, with no one else around, she kept finding ways to dodge his advances for connection, deflecting any opportunity for him to explain himself, let alone any chance for her to forgive him. What an idiot, he thought. This trip was supposed to be his grand gesture to Miranda. She had always wanted to visit the French wine country. He loved the way she said Loire Valley, letting the foreign consonants roll around her mouth. He loved her, and he ruined it. His gut tightened. Total idiot. He needed a drink. It was definitely still drinking time in New York. There were a few extra bottles of wine in the kitchen when they ate dinner. Andrew would just have a glass to help him sleep, settle his nerves. He found his robe and quietly padded across the room, closing the door slowly behind him. His steps echoed in the empty stone hallways. Heavy tapestries lined the walls. In the dim light, the stitched figures appeared to move. Their eyes followed Andrew as he walked down the hall. He stopped walking. In the distance, he could swear he heard a woman crying in pain. Panicked, Andrew ran back toward their room. He flung open the door, ready to save Miranda from whatever made her scream. But she was still snoring away in bed, oblivious. But the crying continued. Andrew followed it to a winding set of stairs. He knew Miranda would chastise him for trying to feed his ego. He always wanted to play the role of the hero, she would say. It was too bad he could never live up to it. But he couldn't ignore the cries of anguish. He had to do whatever he could to help this woman. Andrew stood in front of the door of the chapel. The moaning on the other side was loud, even through the closed door. A sound so anguished that it set his teeth on edge. He slowly pushed open the door, looking inside. The moonlight shone through the stained glass windows, filtering the room in different colors. On the steps of the altar, a woman in a green dress lay face down, weeping and moaning in agony. Andrew slowly approached her and reached out a hand to comfort her. "Are you okay?" The woman whirled slowly to look at him. She tilted her head up, revealing a face covered in bloody gashes. Andrew gasped in horror. The woman's skin was rotten, and her face and body pocked with wounds. There were dark holes in her ruined face, where her eyes and nose should have been. Blackness so intense that Andrew couldn't stand to look at her. He quickly jumped back, unable to breathe. When the dead woman's mouth opened, it released another curdling moan. This time, it was all-consuming. It seemed to vibrate around him and within. Andrew bolted from the room. He ran down the steps, taking them two at a time. But the moans of the dead woman followed him, gained on him. Andrew reached the bedroom and quickly retreated inside, locking the door behind him. He rushed to Miranda, still asleep in their bed, and tried to wake her up, shaking her. But Andrew's effort was futile. She wouldn't be awake for hours still. The sleeping pill worked well. Andrew tried to control his panic, but the moaning was on top of them. The dead woman appeared through the door. Andrew dropped to his knees before her. He could see her teeth and bones through the holes in her putrid skin. "Please," Andrew begged. She entered the room, and his stomach dropped through the floor. The dead woman stood over his cowering frame. His entire body trembled as he watched the ghost slowly glide past him and approach Miranda. "Leave her alone!" Andrew called out. A clanging laugh filled the room. The ghost reached the bed and leaned over Miranda. Before Andrew could move, the ghost disappeared into his wife's body. Miranda's eyes shot open, glowing green. Her green eyes stared through him. "Miranda?" In jerky movements, her body stood up out of the bed. Step by step, her body moved closer, with slow, heavy footsteps. Andrew tried to reason with her. "Miranda, wake up!" Her mouth opened, but only the ghost's curdling moan came out. She reached her hands out toward him. The chateau is currently inhabited by the Marquis de Brissac, the eldest son of the reigning Duke of Brissac. He lives in the chateau year-round with his family. They continue to report sightings of La Dame Verte. Though she has haunted the chateau for over 500 years, the castle is better known as a symbol of luxury in the Loire Valley, rather than a home of a ghost. The house and grounds are open for tours in the summer months. Guests are also invited to stay overnight in a handful of the 152 rooms of the chateau, though they should be prepared for the possibility of running into La Dame Verte in the middle of the night. Thanks for listening to Haunted Places. A new episode comes out every Thursday. Listen to all of Parcast's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, CastBox, TuneIn, or your favorite podcast directory. Many of you have asked how to help the show, and if you enjoy Haunted Places, the best way to help is to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. We'll see you next week. Haunted Places was created by Max Cutler, is a production of Cutler Media, and is part of the Parcast Network. It is produced by Max and Ron Cutler. Sound design by Ron Shapiro, with production assistance by Paul Mahler. Additional production assistance by Carly Madden and Maggie Admire. Haunted Places is written by Abigail Cannon. I'm Greg Polson. And now, please enjoy this preview of Mythology's first episode on the Greek goddess Athena.
It was foolish to challenge the gods. After battling the goddess Athena for 3 days, Enceladus had all but resigned himself to the fate of so many of his fellow giants. But he'd escaped her for the moment, and perhaps that would become his advantage. Enceladus had barely caught his breath when he heard the horses. He whipped around, worried Athena had tracked him to the Ionian Sea, but it was one of Enceladus' own, another giant. As the giant grew closer, Enceladus realized something was wrong. Instead of legs, Enceladus and his brother giants slithered on 2 large serpents with snapping maws where the feet should be. But this giant's serpents weren't snapping, and its face sagged. An arrow whizzed past Enceladus' face. This wasn't a giant. It was a god.
You foolish, foolish giant. No one rebels against the gods and escapes unscathed.
Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, peeled off the face of a giant she'd flayed alive, revealing her own face, dripping with blood. She kept the skin wrapped around her like a cloak. Enceladus's leg serpents snapped and spit at Athena, but their fangs couldn't pierce the hide of his own kind. It was a perfect shield. Athena knocked Enceladus into the Ionian Sea. Then she crouched down and lifted the entire isle of Sikolos. Athena had a divine, godly strength. Plucking an island out of the ocean was as easy for her as it was for a man to pick up his child. Athena straightened up, raising the island above her. She swung it around over Enceladus and slammed the island on his head. Enceladus crumpled under the blow of the island. He sank and then vanished beneath the landmass. His blood and anger rippled outward from the island. the place where Enceladus was defeated became Mount Etna, and the buried giant was reduced to expressing his wrath through eruptions and earthquakes. Yet something wasn't right. As she watched steam build above Mount Etna, Athena knew her heart was missing a piece. She'd used her wisdom and wit to defeat the enemy, embracing her role as a goddess of war, and it felt empty. She was destined for something greater. She was certain. Welcome to Mythology on the Parcast Network. Every Tuesday, we present dramatic stories from ancient mythology and explore their origins. I'm your host and narrator, Vanessa Richardson. Today, we're focusing on the Greek goddess Athena. She's the goddess of war and military strategy, but also the goddess of wisdom, civilization, and the arts. In her mythology, she's caught between who she is and who she wants to be. New episodes of Mythology release every Tuesday, and you can find us and all of Parcast's podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts. At Parcast, we are grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. And if you enjoy today's episode, the best way to help us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really does help us. We also now have merchandise. Head to parcast.com/merch for more information. Something to note in these episodes, all Greek myths have many versions and variations. We've selected those we felt are the most dramatic and entertaining, and supplemented them with additional research into Greek traditions. Additionally, each Greek myth takes place in a wide, expanded universe. While we'll cover some major myths of Athena over the next few episodes, this won't be her only appearance in the podcast. Goddess of the arts and of war, Athena exhibits a dichotomy in Greek culture. She's a woman warrior in a culture where women didn't go to war, and a household goddess who vowed to never be a lover or a mother. Athena is masculine, feminine, and something greater than both. She's a goddess for everyone, and a goddess for no one. Ancient Greek society had clear gender roles, treating women as second-class citizens. But Athena exists outside that construct. She'll skin a giant alive and then go weave a tapestry. She's as apt to teach men gardening and pottery as she is to help them slay their enemies. Unlike her half-brother and rival, Ares, the war god, Athena approaches war with logic and meditation. At the start of a battle, Ares leaps into action, while Athena waits, plans, then leads men to bloody victory. She values rational thinking over emotion, but is not without rage and bloodlust. Classicist Walter F. Otto characterized Athena as the goddess of nearness because she was always beside the Greek heroes in battle, guiding their spears and swords. She is, like all Greek gods, a killer. However, Athena prefers to change errant humans into other forms, doling out punishments while preserving life. She also transforms herself, taking a male appearance multiple times in the Iliad and the Odyssey. That isn't to say she doesn't embrace a female role too. In today's myths, the building of the Palladium, the judgment of Paris, and the story of Arachne, Athena strives to be recognized as feminine, and this may be the hardest battle the goddess of war has ever fought. The king of the gods had a headache, and Zeus's son Hephaestus, like many children, was only making it worse. Hephaestus was god of the forge, born with a clubfoot. To him, a headache was nothing.
And then I realized I could put another axe set on my existing axe and kill 2 men with 1 blow. Genius, right?
Oh, my head is killing me.
That's the idea. Both heads could kill. 2 heads, 1 axe.
Zeus gestured to his forehead, frustrated.
It feels like my skull is expanding and contracting. Maybe I should go
Oh, headache. I thought we were still on axe heads.
Zeus continued moaning as he dropped to the floor, gripped his head, and rocked back and forth. Hephaestus looked on, torn between sympathy and opportunity.
Anything I can do? Maybe take over your duties for a time? Not that a headache could ever take down the great god Zeus.
Oh, Hephaestus, will you...
Hephaestus eyed his brand new double-headed axe. Then Zeus doubled over in front of him. The opportunity was ripe. Zeus had overthrown Hephaestus' grandfather. Perhaps patricide ran in the family.
Make it stop. End it. I'll cut off my head.
Hephaestus hid his grin as he grabbed his double-head axe. After today, the gods of Mount Olympus would bow to Hephaestus. He wound up and aimed straight for Zeus's skull. The axe cleaved Zeus's head in half. As Zeus's eyes spread wide apart, a battle helmet emerged from where his brain should have been. Hephaestus dropped his axe in shock as a fully armored warrior woman sprang from Zeus's head, shouting a battle cry. All thoughts of ruling Mount Olympus faded in the face of this fearsome, beautiful goddess. Ready for battle, Athena stepped out of her father's head and into the light of Mount Olympus. Athena was born without a mother, the child of Zeus alone. She emerged a rational adult, capable of complex thought, and ready to fight for her life. Yet because the Greek gods are modeled on humans, with human flaws and emotions, there is one story of Athena's childhood and a youthful accident that guided the rest of her life. Zeus was accustomed to his children having a mother, so after he fused his head back together, he wasn't sure what to do with Athena. Eventually, the single dad sent his new daughter away to be educated by his nephew, Triton. Triton was a fish-tailed ocean god, so Athena spent much of her time in and around water, and more of her time with Triton's daughter, Pallas. Pallas was a water nymph, a maiden of the ocean, and Athena's only friend. But today, the war goddess and the water nymph raised their swords, squaring off against each other. The pair sparred on the surface of a lake. Pallas floated amid a column of waves, her long hair and shimmering fishtail distracting from her killer aim. Athena defended herself from atop a sleek raft, wearing armor as always. She pushed her sword forward, calling out her moves as she executed them.
Striking, stabbing,
Dodging.
ducking, and slicing.
Lunging.
As Pallas lunged, Athena used her shield to knock Pallas over. Rising from the waves, Pallas spit water into Athena's face.
Hey!
Pallas spouted more water, somehow forming it into perfect concentric circles, like aquatic smoke rings. Athena couldn't help but laugh.
Pallas, be serious. My father's coming to watch us spar tomorrow. We have to impress him.
You have to impress him. If I impress him, you know where I'll end up. And my father won't be happy about that.
You're filthy.
You've heard the stories, and you have 100 half-siblings to prove it.
37. I have 37 half-siblings.
That's an army, warrior goddess.
Let's go again. I want to get that spinning parry right.
Athena was quite skilled in combat. It helped that she took to it naturally, like Pallas to water. She'd been ecstatic to hear Triton declare that they were finally good enough to spar in front of Zeus. The proud fathers had invited a crowd of gods, nymphs, and even a few mortals they fancied. Rowing out onto the lake, Athena fiddled with her helmet. She knew her armor made her look ferocious, but she still felt like a child in a woman's body. What if she fell off her raft? What if her mind went blank and she froze? What if her father, the king of the gods, thought she was only average? A terrifying column of water arose from the depths. Inside it, Pallas. She met Athena's eye and flashed a quick smile. Athena relaxed. She wasn't alone. She had Pallas. With her best friend beside her, Athena had nothing to worry about. They began to spar. In the audience, Zeus watched intently. Next to him, his wife Hera, the goddess of marriage, looked around, intent in a different way.
Aphrodite has such a nice nose, don't you think?
Sure. That's it. Slice and dodge. Well done.
You've never noticed it?
I guess it's fine if you like noses.
It looks quite like Athena's.
Don't start on this again.
I don't understand why you...
She's going to fall in the water.
A wave crashed over Athena, soaking her. Athena slipped, but kept her footing on the raft.
Come on, Athena. You can do it. Get back up there. Raise that sword. You'll win this yet.
They aren't actually fighting. It's a mock spar.
At the end of which, my daughter will win.
Zeus nervously watched Athena struggle through the next few maneuvers.
She's going to fall and embarrass us.
Us? She does have a mother. I knew it.
I meant Athena and myself.
As Zeus worried, Athena relaxed into the rhythm of the spar. She breathed deeply as she pressed her shield against Pallas's sword. Her instincts took over. Suddenly, a new heat rushed through Athena's veins. She'd never felt this warrior power before, but it possessed her. Her feet danced more nimbly. Her sword twisted more sharply. She tasted metal in her mouth. For the first time, she might want to kill. Across the lake, Zeus adjusted his shield. The sun gleamed off of it. Getting an idea, he tilted his shield, aiming the ray of light at Pallas. In the water, the light caught Pallas's eye. She looked up. Meanwhile, Athena stabbed toward Pallas's heart, a final flourish. The perfectly executed move she was born for. This was her gift: combat. Athena lunged, expecting Pallas to dodge as they had rehearsed. She didn't notice that Pallas's face was tilted up, distracted. Pallas looked toward Zeus as Athena's sword pierced her heart. Instead of blood, water flowed from Pallas's wound. She shrank, dissolving, until all that was left were her eyes, which transformed into two wiggling minnows. Pallas was dead. If you enjoyed listening to this preview of our episode on Athena and want to hear the rest of it, search and subscribe to Mythology wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes release every Tuesday.